Good afternoon, all. I'm Adam Myers from the Georgetown University Health in the Public Interest MS program, which I co-direct with Dr. Fu Berman, who's also on this Zoom. We're very happy today to have Peter Maybarduk give the seminar. He'll be introduced formally by Abba, one of our students, momentarily. Let me just say first that the Health in the Public Interest Program is a program that emphasizes the non-clinical or social determinants of health. And I'm sure we'll be touching on some of those issues today, if not directly, at least peripherally. And I also want to mention that we have no seminar next week. We'll return in 2 weeks. So with that, I'll turn it over to Abba to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Myers. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abba Mantri, and it's so great to see you all today. I have the pleasure of introducing to you our guest speaker, Mr. Peter Maybarduk. Mr. Maybarduk is the director of Public Citizens Access to Medicines Group, where he works with partners around the world to improve the affordability and availability of medicines. He's an expert in intellectual property, and his work focuses on drug pricing, innovation policy, pandemic readiness, and global health. Since 2010, the group's efforts under his leadership have contributed to lower costs of essential medicines, supporting health budget sustainability, holding prescription drug corporations accountable, and promoting a more equitable global response to COVID-19, amongst others. Mr. Maybarduk has provided technical and strategic assistance to government agencies and health organizations in dozens of countries, and he helps coordinate the US and global civil society alliances that are focused on access to medicines. His commentary has appeared in various major publications, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. He serves on the governance board of the Medicines Patent Pool, which is a United Nations-backed organization that negotiates licensing agreements to expand access to affordable generic medicines. Mr. Maybarduk studied technology law at the University of California at Berkeley and anthropology at the College of William and Mary. He is an affiliate fellow with the Information Society program at Yale Law School as well. He also founded International Professional Partnerships for Sierra Leone, which is a nonprofit organization that supports public sector development in Sierra Leone. A fun fact about Mr. Maybarduk is that he is a composer and a performer of music. He has released 4 albums, the latest being in 2019, and his songs, according to his bio, bridge classical and rock music. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Maybarduk. Mr. Maybarduk, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks so much. What a great initiative is this, and I'm very glad to be here with you today. I want to talk not just about the policy and facts, but why we do what we do. We actually hold on the slides for a minute. I'll give a little intro, and then we'll bring those up. What has been possible for us to achieve so far in health in the public interest, and hope that's helpful for you in plotting your own course per your own stories. And the best way I know to do that is to tell you just a little bit about mine first, how I came to this work and what it means to me, and also its shortcomings, right? To be honest with you, the things that don't quite work, or where, we struggle to sort of live up to what we say. So I was born in Mexico to a social worker and a US diplomat, and I was raised half here in the DC area, Reston, Virginia, and half in the global south, Nicaragua, Sierra Leone, Cuba, and Venezuela. And my task has been to make meaning and purpose of that beginning. I've always wanted to connect those halves of my life and make them make sense, improve conditions for people in each, and sort of stay rooted in both parts of my story. When I found this work, it wasn't for me about the issue per se. Many of you have sort of tracked access to medicines, know what a great struggle was HIV/AIDS in the United States and around the world, and how many people came to it through their own stories and struggles in their communities and health. I was always more of an ally, and I didn't have a background in health or patents, no special interest in prescription drugs. But I thought that this was an effective way. As I became an activist and learned about different public interest issues, I thought that this was a very effective way for people working across borders to make a big difference together, change the right law or policy with some technical work here, advocacy work there, could potentially save thousands of lives. It's always been about both health and justice. We're committed to work that advances both in everything we do and everything we choose. But that can work out in surprising ways. For example, part of the sort of growing process of humility is discovering the times where as activists, we're sort of really pushing the justice agenda and not doing enough for health. So I've had to work to make those course corrections over time as well. And of course, in the end, it's really about like the folks that we're working with. I stay involved because of the incredible people that we have met doing thankless work all over the world in government ministries, advancing the cause of their countries and health. And like we really want to support them. They blow my mind. And hopefully I have a chance to tell some of their stories a bit as we go. Okay, now we can turn to the slides, which are really just to ground us, give us some facts to hang on to, some structure. I hope not to, lean on them too much. It may be a little more didactic than I mean to be, and we pull them together a little quickly. And I hope what sort of will emerge by the end is we start with a very clear and a very political story, and I believe it, and it's important. And yet, the longer we're here, the more we learn, the more complex it gets, and the more we need to do to sort of serve that, to serve nuance in order to serve health. Okay, next slide. So Public Citizen, we're a consumer advocacy organization with 1 million members and supporters. We've been around for 50 years. We have a really broad range of work: climate work, democracy work, financial regulation. Our Access to Medicines program has always been like a small group within a big organization with a niche mission that we'll hear about, both in terms of the issue, in terms of our methods. We've provided technical assistance. We have, we campaign, we organize, we lobby, but we can't do it all. And so we have to be because there's only a few of us, we have to be pretty thoughtful each time about how we use the power of our group and our allies to make the difference that we want to make. But we work both in the United States and US drug pricing policy and globally, which is what I was first hired to do, is to really work on global access to medicines issues. And it's probably my primary passion. Next slide. So this will be a familiar story for many of you and familiar graphics. In the early history of global HIV/AIDS, 30 years ago, millions of people were dying for lack of access to existing drugs that were priced at more than $10,000 per person per year, even though it was public funding, National Institutes of Health grants, that catalyzed that research in the first place. And it was really a social movement that made the difference. It was millions of people getting on the streets in South Africa and Thailand, and also the innovative work of colleagues like James Love and others who pointed out that actually these same drugs could be made for $1 a day by Indian generics manufacturers. And that process and the process of coverage programs out of Brazil catalyzed a treatment revolution, brought down the cost of AIDS drugs 99% in relatively short period of time, and has saved 20 million lives so far by facilitating the development of the Global Fund and PEPFAR and other AIDS treatment provision programs at the national level. At $10,000 per person per year, the lives of poor people were deemed to be sort of out of the reach of intervention of global donors. It was too much money, at least so they thought. And so this sort of space here where we look at actual pharmaceutical policy and say, do these drugs, do these treatments really need to be so expensive, is what has freed up the resources to make some of the leading health interventions of our time. Next slide. Even after those major victories, of course, today, as we know, people are still struggling. The price of medicines, the launch price of new medicines has been going up in the United States by an average of 15 to 20% over the past 15 to 20 years, every year. So drugs are massively more expensive today, sadly, than I was when I started this work. And some of that has to do with the different kinds of technologies that are being advanced today, but a lot of it has to do with pharmaceutical industry power. Treatment rationing is a huge problem in the United States and all around the world still. Even in the United States, about 1 in 4 people self-ration their own access to treatment because of those treatments' cost. And of course, the situation is worse in countries that have fewer resources. Next slide. So the most basic explanation for this problem, in our view, is monopoly power. Governments give patents that protect 20-year monopolies and new drugs that allow drug makers to price, basically to charge whatever society will pay to care for our sick, with those payments augmented by insurance, right? All of us pooling our resources to pay for people who need treatment in an environment where they don't have meaningful competition. And there's nuance to this, when we're talking about multiple drugs in a class of treatment, but it is the exclusive right to sell a particular drug. And of course, what we want from a medical perspective is for providers to be able to provide the best treatment without regard to cost. And patents make that very difficult. There are other challenges that are sort of in the debate today, like the controversy over pharmacy benefit managers, which do sometimes take advantage of the system. And we support all of those reforms. We're working on those reforms. But drug makers make up the vast majority of the global pharmaceutical market. They're the ones who set the price from the outset. They're the ones who control. And so if we really want to focus on the root of the problem, in our view, we have to look at this problem of monopoly power. If you think about it, like from an economic, lens, in the United States, we didn't even have price negotiation until a few years ago. So like, what are the odds that you get any kind of rational pricing if you give sellers an exclusive right over key health treatments and then even don't have sort of like a process for evaluating what is a fair price or what we really need to pay for research and development. And, in the end, that's our goal. What we want is innovation plus access and rational use. We need to pay for innovation. It is expensive. It's not as expensive as what drug makers say. And the public foots the bill for a lot of it. The leading funder of biomedical research and development are the National Institutes of Health, $50 billion a year. So we have to ask what we're getting in exchange for that upfront payment. Next slide. And I covered this, so I think we can keep it moving. Next slide, please. Of course, this comes connected to a very significant political problem. The pharmaceutical industry has been one of Washington's biggest lobbies for a very long period of time. That's why it took a generation just to get to Medicare price negotiation. There is, on average, close to 3 lobbyists per member of Congress, for example, not specifically tasked to those members, but in terms of sheer numbers. And it's obviously a challenging problem to overcome. Next slide. All right, so what do we do about this? We, in our work, we'll talk about 4 buckets of work, and some of it reaches back a little bit into the past, and I'll work to update that to the present controversies, but to sort of help understand our work and how this has evolved. One is helping countries improve access. This is the first thing I was hired to do, to provide technical assistance in middle-income countries to help them overcome patent barriers. Then there's trade and essentially our defensive agenda against the expansion of pharmaceutical monopoly power. And then some on sort of global systems and pandemics, what you do about a problem like COVID. And finally, US drug pricing and our efforts to change legislation here. So back in 2007, I was sent abroad as soon as I finished my law degree, no time for the bar. The goal was to work in a few Latin American countries that were struggling with patent barriers and set a precedent. The world had just come through the global HIV/AIDS crisis, and some accommodations had been reached in a new, essentially global patent regime that was, in the view of many, going to do quite a bit of harm to access to affordable medicines. But it was negotiated that countries would reserve rights to overcome those patent monopoly barriers in order to expand access to affordable AIDS drugs and other drugs through various mechanisms, one of which was called compulsory licensing. So I was asked to, starting with Ecuador, where we had a few allies, go and see if we could help these countries actually use those flexibilities that had been negotiated through a very long and hard political fight. More on that history, by the way. The United States had actually sided with drug makers, and about 37 of them, I think it was, sued Nelson Mandela for South Africa's efforts to introduce generic drugs. So we had a bad US history in this space, at least up until George W. Bush launched PEPFAR using generics and starting to try to reverse that trend. But there had been these rights that countries have to overcome patent barriers negotiated in the new harmful global rules, but actually helping them use it was going to be key, right? It's one thing to sort of win a victory on paper, and it's a very different thing to have the routine practice of protecting health over commercial interests. I worked initially, so in Ecuador, sent to work with several different allies that had been identified through the international negotiations. And we found it exceedingly challenging. And that is because while countries would sometimes signal their readiness and their enthusiasm for these rights at the international level, that didn't mean the government itself was actually in agreement nationally. And we encountered very significant opposition to the use of any of these rights within Ecuador's cabinet, which turned out to be, like most governments, very divided. Right? The president was essentially a progressive, but he had opposition members in his cabinet, and some were placed in very strategic positions. It took us several months to sort of appreciate that the person who was meant to be our chief ally in that fight was actually coordinating with the opposition and, if I recall correctly, with the pharmaceutical companies to oppose what we were all supposed to be trying to get done together. Ecuador was sort of a situation where there was a lot of civil society had been incorporated into the new progressive government. There was sort of a very bold official path, but this kind of internal resistance. That was very different from some other places where I began to work, like Colombia, where the official politics were neoliberal, were opposed to the kind of reforms that we were asking for, but there was a very strong and organized civil society that could make a significant demand. I spent an awful lot of time in both places, sort of building, little life for myself there as I could over the course of 3-4 years. In Ecuador, I spent about 10 months, made many good friends, more than 20 visits over that period of time. We didn't want this to just be like fly in for an international meeting and leave. There's a really big difference between sort of presenting an idea about what can be done at a conference and then really working it through with the civil servants who are responsible for how that policy goes and if anything goes wrong, and trying to help people through that risky process when it turns out that even governments that are sort of seen as radical are often very risk averse at that level because there are real risks involved. You don't know how Washington's going to respond. You don't know how the pharmaceutical industry is going to respond. And you also don't know who might actually oppose you from within the government. And so it's a delicate process. In Colombia, by contrast, I was invited by some friends to come and present to an HIV/AIDS roundtable. They wanted us to come in and start a campaign, a big public campaign. So in Ecuador, it was like technical assistance with the government behind closed doors. In Colombia, it was public campaigning to try and drive the government to a different place. And I'm just making an effort to sort of compare and contrast two cases of countries that are neighbors but have different politics and how they approach an issue like this and how we resolve it. So, in Colombia, the strategy of our friends, what we settled on was what we were proposing in Colombia. There was a patent barrier to a key HIV/AIDS drug called Coletra, lopinavir plus ritonavir. That was the standard of care treatment at the time. And Colombia was being charged, I think it was 3 or 4 times what its neighbors were being charged for the same treatment. So the question, so what we thought was, could we embarrass the government? Could we say, that's a bit of a national shame that we're paying so much more than our neighbors? And we wrote up technical documents of what the savings could be and what the legal process for issuing what's called a compulsory license to overcome the patent barrier and authorize affordable generics would be. And And that strategy proved effective. President Alvaro Uribe was sort of taken aback by how much more Colombia was paying. And even though he didn't want to go as far as the activists would go, because he's an ally of Washington, right? He has a different philosophy of these things. He did decide to take, and the government did decide to take unilateral action to lower the prices of those drugs. They put on a form of price control, and the government and courts would eventually penalize Abbott and one of the ministries for failing to initially enforce price controls. Over time, those AIDS drug prices came down about 90% and saved Colombia an awful lot of money to expand treatment and services. So that was an example of public campaigning working over a period of, I think it was 2 to 3 years, maybe a bit more. In Ecuador, by contrast, we actually sort of had to deal with this kind of enemy within. And what happened eventually there was we had, it was later sort of shown in leaked cables that came out that there were opposition ministers coordinating with the pharmaceutical industry and coordinating with U.S. Embassy who sought to block the emerging politics of health sovereignty and compulsory licensing and overcoming patent barriers. They failed when they tried to enlist other wealthy countries in their course of action, and the issue was eventually forced to a big meeting in the presidential palace, where the president replaced the head of the patent office and said, "Folks, this is going to be our course of action. We're going to do this. We're going to get it done." And over a period of several years after that, like I could go on and on about sort of like the various sort of traps that we ran into, but Ecuador saved nearly half a point of GDP by using compulsory licensing and the prospect of overcoming patent barriers as the backstop for its drug price negotiation. So we would negotiate with drug makers and say, we want you to lower your prices. And if you don't, we're going to authorize generic competition. You know we'll do it because we've done it before. Drug makers are very averse to losing their monopoly. So this is a very powerful form of leverage, and it worked well for Ecuador. Just to clarify, in case I didn't, right? So for the folks who are like really trying to track the policy of this, there are global rules on patents under the World Trade Organization, or essentially global rules. There are exceptions. One of them is called a compulsory license, a very short document that a country can issue that says, even though there's a patent, we'll authorize generic competition to make our medicine affordable, and we will pay royalties to the patent holder instead of the monopoly pricing in order to compensate for innovation. So that is how it worked. And I see we've got a question in the chat, and I've been talking for a while already. So I want to like try and pause for clarity. And I hope Adam and Adrian and Abba, you'll feel free to guide me there. By the way, that's our website if folks want to look at some of what we've been up to. So let's see. Oh, drug interaction. Okay, we'll come back to that on topic. So do we feel like, patents, monopoly power, generic competition, pricing, affordability, what we're trying to do, clear enough? Or is there a point you guys think I should clear up?
I can ask a question really quickly since we're on this topic. You quoted like something you just said on the previous slide was that like innovation plus access plus rational use is like a good way to approach problems related to like providing the best treatment regardless of the cost of the drugs because of patents. So if we were to like focus on innovation, have it be like funded by like would you say that this part should be funded by the government and taxpayers? And if so, would that be like a good way to ensure or think about the return on investment? Because if we're thinking of talking to like in the current administration on like expanding access and like providing funding, they probably are going to want to see a financial incentive to this. So do you think that this type of like funding strategy could see a positive return on investment? I don't know if that's a lot in one.
So like public funding and a public pharmaceutical system as opposed to relying on the patents. I mean, we definitely think that like, monopoly is not rational, right? Like no one who is really trying to solve that formula of getting the kind of medical innovation we need and the kind of access we need and ensure rational use, no one would set up a monopoly system from scratch because it's guaranteed to produce treatment rationing and high costs and the wrong kinds of R&D investments. We've arrived at this point due to a combination of lobbying power and historical accident, right? Inheriting the patent system from other sectors. When patents were developed, there wasn't such a thing as a pharmaceutical industry. This stuff dates back to the 15th century, but it's been designed to cover this area of innovation. And while, it is effective in spurring innovation, it also comes with tremendous inefficiencies and loss. It's a very big question how to put in place something better. And here again, we work very closely with James Love and some others who have big proposals for that. You can replace patents with a combination of grants and prizes. You can also supplement them. You can also regulate prices. The big dream is something called like delinkage, where you separate the cost of R&D from the prices that patients pay. But we don't think that we all have to agree on exactly what the solution would be to make progress in the present. And we don't want to be like, I can't be in this myself solely for like the end goal of overthrowing the whole system, because it's a very big project, right? And like, I think we all have to find our place by doing things that we know are going to contribute. And we sort of choose our campaigns according to what we think is going to move the ball toward a better system and help countries look at better innovation plus access regimes, and also help people access more treatments in the moment. And so we always sort of like, just like with the Columbia compulsory licensing, where our message to Columbia was overcome the patent barriers, overcome generic competition, or introduce generic competition. But we knew that even if they didn't accept what we wanted them to do, they might go halfway. And they did. And what they did was lower cost and expand treatment for a lot of people and start opening up a politics that Columbia still follows of new and innovative pharmaceutical policy that makes a difference in a variety of areas. So that's how we look at it. So in the interest of time, I'll keep moving, but please, moderators and everybody, feel free to like flag me down if you think that, we need to pin down a topic before we go. But I was first hired to do years of intensive travel and technical assistance and like make relationships and partnerships on the ground to help countries actually work through the use of these rights that so many people had worked hard including in these countries, to negotiate at the global level. That was sort of the first top phase of my work, and it's something that we still do. Next slide. But there's another agenda. If we think of that as like our offense toward catalyzing access, we also play defense. And there is a long history, including in the World Trade Organization's TRIPS agreement, of pharmaceutical companies expanding their power globally through trade agreements, writing intellectual property chapters into agreements that people historically thought of as being about tariff lines and other subjects. Pfizer takes a lot of credit for helping write the global patent rules under WTO. And ever since that time, pharmaceutical companies have sought to ever increase their levels of monopoly protection through trade agreements. One example of our work in this area was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was a major initiative under both the Bush and then Obama administrations, and became a top priority of the Obama administration in its second term. But there was a problem. Amidst the sort of efforts to expand cooperation in the Asia Pacific were these long chapters of wish lists from K Street lobbyists that would expand corporate power over public interest rules. And not only in health, but they include these investment courts that tobacco companies have used and mining companies have used to overcome public interest rules in different countries. They include rules on internet liability and restricting access to copyrighted educational materials. But our mission, of course, was health. And we were working with Doctors Without Borders and Third World Network and others to figure out what was being negotiated in this agreement that was going to impact, for example, countries like Vietnam, 90 million people with a very different standard living than people in the United States. We knew from history that there were likely to be these damaging provisions, but the texts of these agreements aren't secret. They're shared among, or aren't public, sorry. They're shared among negotiators and not published, right? And so we had sort of a dual mission of figuring out what's going on and then finding a way to challenge it, starting from scratch with like no access to the negotiation and not really any productive relationships in the US government on, at least not major relationships, because there was already at this point a 15-year history of the U.S. Trade Representative's office, which is a cabinet level position located right next to the White House in Washington, D.C., and access to medicine activists just yelling at each other unproductively, being totally opposed to each other's interests and finding very little room for compromise. We made comments to the US government on what we thought some of the dangers and harms would be. We didn't get very far. And we thought to ourselves, this is a negotiation with a lot of different countries. We actually might have some relationships in those countries, and maybe we should just work on going and building our alliances with other governments. And so that's what we did. We started attending the negotiations, whether invited or not, and it started with a lunch. Sonia Reed Smith from Third World Network, who's a fantastic activist, and myself out like stalking the halls looking for delegates and saying, why don't you guys, what do you need? And could we sit down for lunch during your break and just talk about some of the interests at stake? Of course, the US government didn't want this, and some of the other governments were shy. There are real differences in how countries negotiate, we found. So like Latin American countries and New Zealand were very vocal at the negotiating table. But Vietnam, Singapore, other places, very, very quiet, very more private in their approach to what they thought. So it was a challenge to get to a point of trust where delegates would be willing to meet with civil society activists and talk with us about what we were trying to do together. But they came and we talked, and we invited the other side too. We had the corporate lobbyists present also, just to sort of break through that initial wall of being able to have a conversation. And from there, we asked negotiators, okay, what do you need? What kind of analysis do you need? Not every country is as well staffed as the United States. Like these negotiation rooms, reportedly, because we weren't allowed in them, you'd have 2 negotiators from every country at the table, but then you could have your advisors around the wall. And so like the wall of the room is just surrounded by US negotiators. Whereas if you're Brunei, it's just the 2 of you, right? You don't have any staff. So we staffed them. We did the analysis that they needed, even if it was a little outside of our issue area. And we tried to earn trust by admitting inconvenient truths. We didn't want to always say that the answer is what we wanted it to be. If there was a fact that could hurt our case, we actually tried to reveal it, at least be a little bit open about it, because we really needed to build people's trust over time that we weren't going to work against their national interest. Our thesis here was you had the United States, which houses the patent-based pharmaceutical industry, and then you had other countries that either have no pharmaceutical industry or primarily a generics industry, and people that really need access to treatment. And so we thought there was a natural alliance to make where other countries didn't actually have to just accept the US terms in this case. And that is what eventually happened. We facilitated some leaks of text, and were able to mount public criticism. And the negotiators at the intellectual property table, and there are many different issues in these negotiations, but at that table, they got more and more critical and tougher on the United States, more bold in speaking up about their concerns, until the intellectual property negotiations essentially paused on pharmaceutical issues and made no progress for 18 months. That in the end is what it took to put this entire trade negotiation under a magnifying glass, until it essentially collapsed under its own weight. Negotiators were trying to avoid the US election season because trade politics are always delicate in the United States, but they landed square in that season. And, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and eventually Hillary Clinton all roundly criticized the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it went down. Now, like, in the sort of spirit of my opening comments about like we're trying to have sort of an open view and learn about things, it wasn't necessarily my goal or mission to sink a trade agreement, though there were some good reasons to. But I sort of think, as grown up today and all that, there are a lot of complicated interests at stake. And I don't claim the wisdom to sort of know all the pros and cons of every line of that. That text was thousands of pages long. It's complicated. But what I do know is had the United States been able to say no to Big Pharma, they wouldn't have had to worry about me. And they couldn't do it. And that's a concerning signal that, what's going on is really not in the public interest. Our job was to turn back those provisions that were harmful to health, and we did that. And so it's still something, I think we take some pride in. Next slide, please. And I'll try and accelerate a little bit here because I know we got a lot to get through, but that sort of laid the framework for changing U.S. trade policy over time. And some fantastic leaders like Biden's U.S. Trade Representative, Katherine Tai, have really had signature roles in changing the way that the United States thinks about trade and removing some of these lobbyist-informed measures in an effort to make trade more about benefiting average people and the public interest that we all hold dear, including labor, environment, health, others. It's probably a little much to get into here, but I'll say that, particularly in the latter stages of the Biden administration, that government really did some fantastic work to try and stop leaning on developing countries over the patent issues, among other things. And the Biden administration left office with a very different U.S. footprint on trade that we hope is going to be the starting point for future Democratic administrations and maybe any future administration that's a bit more sane than the one that we have in office today. A lot of credit goes to many people on that work, but even now with the sort of tariff wars and the other battles we're fighting, which we can come back to, there is part of what you do in public interest work, right, is you try and establish a precedent. You say, how far did we get here? And even if it's taken down, you have that example to build on in the future. And a few years from now, we'll be able to say, here's what the policy was and should continue to be. Okay, next slide. COVID. I sometimes feel like what we've done in this work is bridge two major global crises. I was brought in after the peak of the global HIV/AIDS crisis and was, in a management position by the time COVID hit. And the question on everyone's mind from early days was, are we going to relive the same experience of people not having access to the treatments that they need to get through this thing? From the early days, my daughter was born about 3 weeks before we were all sent home. And it was sort of clear to folks, I think, who were looking at the data that this wasn't going to be a couple months. We might be home for a couple of years. There were more than 100 vaccine candidates in development from the get-go. And it truly is like an incredible scientific accomplishment and so much credit due to the US research establishment and NIH and other institutions that are now being gutted, that we were able to develop vaccines so fast. There was pretty great confidence in global health that there would be a COVID vaccine, but also great fear because we knew there wasn't going to be enough. There wasn't going to be enough to go around, and there was going to be a problem of inequity and apartheid. We thought on our strategy on this, and we felt that our biggest role was to try and influence the U.S. government, since it has a lot of power and a lot of money, and we're here in Washington, D.C. And we didn't think it was a tenable strategy to just say, share better, share what you have, although that's critically important. And COVAX and the global initiative led out of WHO was, the essential and determinative idea in the global COVID response. But our strategy was, we really governments are going to be nationalistic. That's going to happen. We can fight it, but it's going to happen. They're going to hoard. They're not going to share equitably. And we have to have a strategy to deal for that reality. And our strategy was, how do we make enough vaccine for the world? How do we empower other countries to make their own? How do we do that quickly? And I won't go too much into sort of everything that we did, but we had sort of signature legislation. Let's invest $25 billion to make 8 billion mRNA doses within a year. We mapped out, working with engineers at Imperial College, we mapped out the processes that would be needed for that and published the first public analysis of end-to-end mRNA production. We looked at our colleague Zain Rizvi, who did just fantastic research in this area. We looked at the US government's rights in the COVID vaccines. We fought to get access to the vaccine contracts and to see what rights the government retains. So another piece of this whole puzzle is when the government funds biomedical research, like the NIH Moderna vaccine, what rights does the government have to ensure affordability or equity or decide how those technologies are distributed? The US government had power that it did not use initially. The most effective COVID vaccine, NIH Moderna, was a partnership between those institutions from day one. Public scientists had critical roles in each aspect of its invention and subsequent development, and the vaccine was funded in its development almost entirely by US taxpayers. So you'd think we'd have some say. But the history of this, unfortunately, is that we give away that say, and it's really pharmaceutical companies that decide how even publicly funded treatments will be marketed. And in the case of Moderna, that meant charging higher prices to developing countries than to wealthy countries, and putting developing countries at the back of the line. And it took a lot of advocacy and force to eventually get Moderna and other companies to play more ball with WHO and to contribute more to the global response. It also took a lot of advocacy to get the US government involved, because initially, the Trump administration pushed warp speed. That was good. But of course, it was also into anti-science and very much into nationalism. And that just wasn't even a conversation. So we had to wait a year for the Biden administration transition team to get into place before we could really start having conversations with the US government about equity. In those first months, and this is reported in Politico and elsewhere, the White House was not bought in. They were concerned that they would run across the Make America Great Again sort of strand and hurt themselves politically if they did too much about global COVID. And it took activism and also Delta wave, if I remember right, and all the sort of terrifying scenes out of India for the White House to really change its mind and dig in and support the people within the administration that were already fighting hard on global COVID. It's possible one or two of them are on this call, and maybe they can share whatever part of the story they would like later. But over time, there were fantastic voices within the US government that were pushing hard to contribute as much as the US could, to mobilize resources, to feed the supply chains, to put funding into the global response. And we feel like we did a lot. We worked hard with allies all over the world to try and push that, to push criticism and encourage the US government to take a bigger role, which ultimately the White House really stood up at sort of key moments with a big contribution of money and vaccine donations that helped stabilize COVAX at a moment when it could have gone under and the whole global response could have failed. So sometimes, with health, just the right decision at the right time can protect so many people's lives. And we lost millions of lives needlessly through COVID, but we also collectively protected millions more. And hopefully next time we'll do better with faster action and more preparedness. But it wasn't nothing. COVID was something that just people all over the world worked very hard together for a couple of years and really sacrificed their own personal lives to try and find a way through, to try and improve the global response. And it's an impressive cohort of people in government, outside of government, in the private sector too, in international organizations. And, today with life back to normal and everyone, we don't even want to think about COVID, right? But it's sort of, I don't know, that's sort of the service that we all did when it was needed, and we keep learning from today. A word about what we learned. I think we can go to the next slide here. A word about sort of what we learned. It's coming back to this theme of I don't know if this rings true for me at this point or not, but we've had to, I talk in these terms about monopolies and pharma power, and it's true and it's a huge problem. And it's just also true that none of these problems are that simple. And that was the big lesson for all of us through COVID. People who worked on patents had to sort of learn and accept that delivery was every bit as big a challenge as the folks who work on delivery were saying. And people who worked on delivery and community education, came to sort of appreciate that the kind of power that the industry was wielding and the different kind of investments that need to be made and the lack of production in different parts of the world was a problem too, right? And so after COVID, one of the sort of one of the sort of I don't know, promising spots for me is that I feel like we're having different conversations today as people in health than we were having before that crisis. And it's because we all had to learn the thing that we're charged to work on is no kind of panacea unless we can figure it all out together. Okay, next slide. So we're already at 45, right? So I think I'll pause for the chat. I think I need to move through the rest pretty quickly here. Any guidance from the moderators? Welcome. I talked about, this sort of general issue, like a lot of public research. We can keep going on the slide. Let's move through.
Yeah, don't worry about it. You've already taken some questions, so yeah, don't worry about
Okay,
it.
all right. Well, so since COVID, we've learned a lot, and there, even in this environment with the cuts and the terror from the current administration, there are places where progress advances. One exciting development, and even in bipartisan ways and global ways, one exciting development is that NIH eventually stood up and said, yes, you know what? We are co-owners of the Moderna vaccine. Yes, we're co-inventors of that. Yes, we want to be listed. Yes, we want you to pay us royalties. And eventually, yes, we think that we think that the companies that take our research should make clear access commitments to us. And so today, when the NIH licenses out a federally developed invention, drug makers have to submit plans for how they're going to make those inventions available, affordable, accessible, sustainably so for the public. And in some ways, it's modest, but it wasn't true before. And if that policy had been in place before COVID, the US government would have had both like more leverage and expectation in practice in saying to Moderna, for example, you are going to work with WHO, you're going to make that vaccine affordable. And by the way, you're not going to spike the price of the vaccine on Americans either. So this is now, this policy is in effect at NIH. And not only from the Biden administration, but we understand that the Trump White House has approved this policy as well. It's in the WHO pandemic agreement. Vaccine funders are working to get similar language into different agreements around the world. And Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, a student group, is spreading language like this for university research around the world. So access planning is sort of a new way of getting at some of these issues that doesn't involve having to like take a company's patent after marketing and have a big fight. It's drug makers are told far in advance on a level playing field across all of them. Here's what we expect. Let's have a conversation about access. And it seems to be a more acceptable way to go for everyone involved. Okay, next slide, please. Well, just a few words about the United States. Big change here to finally have Medicare price negotiation in place in the last few years. And there too, the Trump administration has embraced the same and said, we're going to keep up drug price negotiation. It's incredibly popular. And so there's sort of no going back. Like this issue, unlike some of the other issues that people in health are dealing with these days, lowering drug prices has bipartisan support, strong bipartisan support, particularly among the people, right? It's everyone wants drug prices to come down. The question is, how do you get there? We're very critical of Trump's policy on drug pricing. We think a lot of it is a distraction. A lot of it is sort of an effort to protect drug makers from real change for a period of time and to pass the blame on European countries and others instead. We don't think it makes a lot of sense. We were talking to European regulators yesterday about being with them in that fight. But, on the whole, like there's a trajectory here where we're building our political power to make medicine more affordable in the United States. And it takes time. We can go to the, well, I have here a SOTU response. So yeah, President talked bigly about drug pricing last night. There's interest in the questions. We've just put out a fact check, a myth buster on that. You can find it on citizen.org/access if you want to see it. And I'm happy to address it in questions, but let's go to the next slide. Trump RX, by the way, it's just a glorified website. It's not a big deal. 43 medicines out of 20,000 FDA approved products, and most of them are available more affordably somewhere else. So if you need medicine, go to your pharmacist. Don't go to Trump RX. You might wind up paying more. Okay, counter arguments. So but how do we pay for innovation, right? And shouldn't we be taking that seriously? Yes, and we do. it's a big conversation. Again, there's a lot of public funding. Drug companies actually spend a lot on buybacks and dividends. And in some cases, like the first IRA negotiated drugs, drug makers spent more enriching themselves than they did on research and development. So like the incentives aren't there right now the way that they should be, and we can do better. But it's true that like if we were to cut extremely deeply into drug company revenue, then we'd want to have a theory of like what that's going to do to innovation and how we sort of make up for it in different ways. So we do, and we try and like target mechanisms accordingly. But it's also the case that right now prices are not derived from R&D costs. Of course not. That's not how any business prices. They price according to their ability to maximize revenue in a market, and here they're protected by patents. So we think we have a long way to go before you got to sort of have a conversation about redirecting those funds. Next slide. I guess I'm done. Okay, so, oh no, wait, there should be one more in here. Do you see a slide? What's the previous slide? Got one called Paths Forward anywhere? Missing it somehow. That's all right. It just talked about sort of a few of the reforms that we're looking at. But we've really hit them. I'll conclude, I think, and then we can go to questions. So well, progress on health just depends on many, many different streams of work, and we all have something to contribute to it. If you look at COVID or more recently Mpox, it's not enough to bring down the prices or even increase the supply. You have to have this sort of agreement between countries that are struggling, countries that are in a position to donate, the regulatory structures, the political will. You have to fight disinformation, and it's a challenge. And even in these fights, when we're sort of like diametrically opposed, I mean, we're in a time now where pharmaceutical companies are, be too strong to say allies of ours, but they're fighting research cuts, right? And they support vaccine science, and we sort of have to be able to identify the areas of common interest in order to keep moving forward together. I'm reminded of a guy who was about my age in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, who it was his job to get those bad patent rules passed, and it was my job to fight him. And as we sort of wound up together in these little negotiation locations all over the world, like we came to respect one another's strategy and the kind of work that we were putting in and what we were trying to achieve, from his perspective, like a rules-based trade order that respected the U.S. interest and so on. Over time, it turned out that he was a dear friend of a dear friend. We all wound up going to see Avengers Endgame together and getting recommendations on what to see when I was in Mexico City, So that's Washington for you. We're going to be opponents and still have to live together and can even be friends. And that's not a lack of conviction or purity. That's pluralism. That's maturity. And that's what it takes for our country to function and work together. And if we can hold those ideas in our head at the same time, like push the thing that we believe and know to be true, make a contribution, but also like sort of be open to like learning and having to like diversify and soften our work over time, maybe our turns in power don't need to be so destructive. But the best parts of this work and the worst can be the people. There are some who would mislead even in activism and just advance their own cause. I didn't get to tell a story about COVID, but like part of the reason I say this stuff about sort of like sensitivity and drug makers and so on is, some of our friends were telling a story in COVID that like if you just solve patents, you'll solve COVID. And that reached a point where it actually hurt some of the legislative effort to put billions of dollars into the global COVID response. So we have to be careful and we have to be responsible as activists. But there are unassuming people doing incredible work. You'll never know their names, but just like in their government ministries, advancing health, being honest and doing everything they can to fight, um, to fight. And, I'll share some of their names with you. Maruja Crescente, Ruben Espinosa, Luz Marino Mbasilla, Laura Saron, Javier Llamosa. These are people who like really stood up for their countries when it counted and advanced health without any public glory. And I have so much respect for that. And all I really want to do is help them out. And that's why I'm still doing this work 20 years later. So thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Mr. Maybarduk. That was a really informative presentation, and the stories were really interesting to listen to. So as general information, I will be taking questions from my colleagues first in the Happy program, and then I will open the floor up to the general audience. Feel free to ask questions in the chat or by raising your hand on Zoom. So if anybody wants to ask a question, yes, please, June, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. It was incredibly informative and really interesting to hear. I actually wanted to ask a question about kind of something you just said about like the State of the Union and Trump RX and all that. So obviously as it exists, it is not super helpful to anyone. But if you kind of had to take sort of the essence or the goals of that program and kind of reformat it into something that actually would work, where would you start? Would that be with patents or attacking another area like affordability?
Well, I wouldn't really start with Trump RX. It really is just a website that funnels people to other websites that sell medicines to consumers directly. And the problem with that is they're too, the prices are too high for people who don't have insurance. And for people who have insurance, it would be cheaper to get your medicines through insurance. So like that sort of like direct to consumer platform is not really the solution. There are those things that it's really interesting, right? Because of course, there's still like people are trying to take some people trying to take these problems seriously on the inside and solve them seriously with the political conditions they're given. And, the administration has put forward some models to get at what they call most favored nation pricing, what some people here might think of as reference pricing, where we tie the prices that Americans pay to the prices paid in other countries as a way of like having some kind of metric and keeping our prices down. Not everything about that. We actually think so Americans pay about triple what other countries pay for prescription drugs. It's totally outrageous. And we do think that is probably the path to political reform. To get a really big signature legislation in the United States to lower drug prices, you probably want to campaign on bringing down prices to what other countries pay and maybe have a reference pricing mechanism. How to do that in a way that leads to like a proper evaluation of the technologies involved, a proper price evaluation, an actual fair and appropriate price, and is sensitive to the needs of the countries you're going to reference. Because now you have like people like the CEO of Pfizer saying outrageous things like, well, if France doesn't raise its prices, we'll just leave France. We just won't sell medicines to France. Why? Because like France would be a reference price for the United States. Now, I don't think they're actually going to do that with France, but like for a very small country that pays lower prices for pharmaceuticals, they may actually be worried that pharmaceutical industry will go nuclear on them and work very hard to change prices there or delay launches or not sell drugs in their market in order to not risk losing money in the United States, if that makes sense. It can be a little complicated to get into. So is there a way to design a really good program that protects other countries and opens the political paths forward here? Because I think the other thing we do at Public Citizen is we sort of have to think politics first, in the sense that like what should be and what is the right policy, but also if you actually want to make it happen, sort of have to recognize like that there is a way through politics and through how people look at issues to get there. And it's probably that here. But yeah, ultimately, if we wanted to sort of rebuild pharma or do things right, you'd have to have a lot of patent reform. You'd have to think differently about the monopoly structure and invest. We should just be investing a tremendous amount of money in research and development, right? I mean, it pays such incredible dividends through our public institutions. And then let's have better sort of conditionalities on how those technologies that we incubate are commercialized. By the way, I did notice one name in the I don't know if I should call folks out, but I'm seeing one or two friends on the line that I know have served the US government in these roles and from whom like we have a tremendous amount to learn. And I just want to recognize their work in COVID and everywhere else. And we see you and we appreciate what you're doing. And please feel free to, you know, correct me where I'm unfair. Thanks.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from another student in the Happy program. Jero says, thanks, Mr. Maybarduk, for this amazing presentation. Climate change is driving expanded geographic range for vector-borne diseases, particularly affecting tropical developing countries. Brazil just faced record dengue cases. Central African countries are seeing changing malaria patterns. So are there specific access to medicine challenges emerging from these climate-driven disease burdens? And how should the access community prepare for evolving pharmaceutical needs in low-income tropical countries that are facing the impacts of climate change?
I think it's a great question, and unfortunately, the answer is, I don't know enough. This is like we're a small team. We haven't sort of done adequate preparation in that space. We do sort of look at we work a little more on the sort of medicines that are commercialized with like high price models and significant patent protections than we do on some of the lower cost interventions because of these politics that we're fighting. That's not because I think that's the most important thing. I mean, the sort of advent of malaria vaccines are just incredible health developments. And I guess what I'd say about it is we do work with friends all over the world, like Doctors Without Borders, MSF, DNDi, the Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative. And when they say, "Hey, we could use your help with this key health priority," we try and we try and weigh in. And we're always open to folks reaching out and say, you should be looking at, for example, the malaria vaccine and like take a shot on improving the procurement transparency, the pricing, whatever it may be, so make our contribution. But I guess what I'm saying is we have to know our niche. I can't claim to be sitting here and like, solving all of these health problems. We've got a niche, but they're big ones. Maybe the other thing I'd say about climate change it like cuts against the question. I don't mean to I'm just trying to be useful, but there was recently a Future of Immunization initiative hosted by Gavi and WHO and UNICEF, where they brought vaccination experts together to talk about what they thought the world of immunization would look like 25 years in the future and what we should start preparing today to deal with that environment. And part of the exercise was to figure like, what are the scariest issues that we might have some ability to influence? And climate change, surprisingly, just for the issue of vaccination, not for all its other disruptive effects, it didn't come out on top. And the reason was because people felt that some of the technological developments were going to mitigate the new challenges of climate change and that we should actually focus on things like disinformation. So it's critically important. And that was just sort of like, one word from the field of folks that are working on that issue. Thanks.
Go ahead, Dr. Myers.
So I don't want to take up time from students who have questions. So please, while I'm talking here, raise your hand if you have one. But Peter, thanks for a great presentation. I wanted to mention, for the sake of the great audience that we have here, that we have a talk in 2 weeks. We have no seminar next week, but we have a talk in 2 weeks from Dr. Dean Baker, who's going to talk about the waste and corruption, patent-supported drug development. So that's kind of a good follow-on, I hope, to Peter's talk. I wanted to ask a quick question, which is that, Peter, you mentioned the need for making much more investment in basic science and development of rather than clinical trials, which Dean is going to be talking about, but putting a lot more money into science. And so who's going to pay for that? I mean, ultimately, what's going on now is that the federal government is funding it through the NIH, and that money is derived either from the national debt or from taxes that are paid mainly by the middle class of America. So I'm not trying to make a political argument here. I'm just
Yeah.
wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think it's worth it. I think that the research and development investments come back to us in yes, obviously in health and in lives saved and in improved lives, but also just as economic calculation, they save a tremendous amount of money in protecting people from hospitalization and helping people be productive and all the other ways. And that's not, of course, just me saying that. That's a line that, the pharmaceutical companies would say the same thing. And most congressional Republicans would say the same thing. There was an interesting analysis that came out just this week, I think, that suggested that, if you look historically, Republicans actually have a little bit of an edge in funding government research over Democrats. They've been very committed to it. And then that includes NIH right up until this administration. But, the hopeful line is you sort of see the difference between what the Trump administration believes and what Republicans in Congress believe, and you can start to see like a path forward to continue to sustain that. It's a big government. We make big investments, and this is one of the best ones we can possibly make. The COVID vaccine saved a lot of lives, and people forget this, but I was just tabulating this on the side. If you look at all the deaths from all U.S. conflicts and wars combined, the total, if I'm not mistaken, is about 1.2 million, which is also how many Americans died from COVID. So, I mean, the tolls in public health are just immense, right? And like our ability to continue to invest in the interventions that saves lives, because that total could have been so much worse. It's just obviously worth it. But yes, it's taxes, right? I mean, that's how we're doing it.
Okay, thank you. That's a very powerful argument. I don't disagree with it at all. So I see the moderator has some people to pick on at this point.
Yeah, Sophie, whenever you're free, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I had a bit of a hard time with my Wi-Fi today, so you might have covered this a bit already, but I wanted to ask, you mentioned like vaccine apartheid in the kind of the context of COVID, or I've also heard vaccine nationalism used as a similar, concept. I think that, one thing I've been thinking a lot about is that the mechanisms we have, like you were talking about some policy that, I think in the US has now passed that I think can combat that in a lot of ways. But, I think I think about the patients and the people that need these drugs the most. And I think justice most often comes quite late to them. So, I'm curious if there's any sort of like when a situation arises, if there's kind of immediate little things that we can do that don't take, years and a lot of work, like, policies and campaigns and, like economic incentives or, anything like that. But,
Specifically to fight nationalism or apartheid, like on the global stage?
Sure. Yeah. Or even just kind of, I guess, yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a very large and tough question. I mean, I think like the front line of defense is awareness when it comes to infectious disease. It spreads, it mutates, it doesn't respect borders. So every step we take to mitigate that and fight it at its source comes back to our benefit. And people who are in science, fight hard for that principle. It's kind of like about us. It's kind of back to us to advance the kind of politics collectively that will stand up for it when the time comes. People are working now to sort of put in place better preparedness and resilience initiatives and prevention. We saw from Mpox, kind of at the tail end of COVID, that even when there was this tremendous U.S. government effort that involved more than 200 staff to try and like get Mpox vaccines where they needed to go, and you didn't see us like come out and mounting, criticism of the U.S. government there, at least in the latter stage of that, because we knew this was happening and they were blocked by like regulatory challenges and just not having in place the frameworks for countries to accept the essentially experimental vaccines that were available and distribute them across the country. So there are just all kinds of challenges to solve now before the next pandemic arrives. But of course, it's true also, we have to do the sharing. We can put in our line of work, you can put into the contracts that you're signing with vaccine makers now a guarantee that they will pledge X% to the global effort. that they will share the following things that are needed as a condition of receiving that funding, right? So there are lots of things that we can do, but that's one of them. But we have to fund health delivery. We have to fund community awareness on the ground. It's all these things together.
Thank you so much. That was a great response.
Yeah, I wanted to squeeze in one more question if that's okay. You talked about like advocacy abroad and like working with different governments and different people abroad and how like you guys were able to enact real change. So I was wondering if you could get into how it works like building connections abroad. Like I know
Oh
you've
yeah.
had personal connections between growing up in Latin America and the US. So how would you go about doing that?
People know people and you get introduced to people, but like it's the public interest. So these are social movements. It's been sort of my charge to try and protect, advance, and grow a social movement that predated my arrival. Everyone that fought together in the trenches to create an initial response to global HIV. And so I inherited some of those relationships. And, we all in the program, my colleague Megan is on today, we all sort of work together to build those connections over time. If folks are sort of interested to join up in what we're doing and see how we talk with each other, for our part, we have a couple of communities, one on US drug pricing that we call RX Allies, and one on global access to medicines that we call COVID-19 Access, that bring together experts and advocates from all over the country and all over the world to exchange information and analysis and to see each other and talk on the phone, and talk in Zooms just like this every couple of weeks to exchange tactics. That was really important at the beginning of COVID because we knew that we were going to have to learn some new lessons about vaccines and vaccine production and technology. And so what we did is we went out and invited organizations to sign on to help us develop a set of principles that would guide our work together, something that would speak to both the health and the justice, and then use that as the basis for a community that would trade information in real time about vaccines and developments and that we're still using today to coordinate some of that work. And we do it in a way that's not public facing. We do it just to talk with each other, even though it's a large community. So staying in touch and keeping that connectedness is important.
Awesome. Thank you. Dr. Myers, do you have anything else to add or?
I think there's some things in the chat. If any of you want to make a more general contribution by turning your mics on, I'd encourage you to go ahead. We have just a couple minutes left.
I see one more question. What do you think is a fair and equitable way to conceptualize reasonable prices and profits for American drug companies, and how does this differ from the current system for calculating medication pricing?
Challenge is that all our prices right now can only refer back to the prices of other drugs that were also developed under sold under monopoly conditions, right? So like there's no rational pricing out there anywhere in the drug market that you can base new prices on. But we can use different kinds of like health technology assessments. If we really go back to some threshold questions, we can work at methods of coming up with a fair price. And Suri Moon is one academic who's worked on this. There are many others. We have to ask. I think you got to start from the R&D costs. So we need transparency into the R&D costs and ask like how much does innovation really cost? How much do we have to pay? Because you don't want to overpay. We don't pay like the value of water or condoms, right? Because they'd be incredibly expensive, but they're inexpensive to make, so the prices are low or they are public goods. So we have to look at medical technology a bit similarly in the sense of like what does it cost to have the innovation that we need? So we need transparency in what the R&D costs really are, and the pharmaceutical companies don't disclose that. So you got to have like transparency legislation and other measures to get that out. And then you start like assessing, okay, how do we want to pay for that innovation, and how can we keep our innovation framework developing over time as the cost of R&D changes and is different for different technologies. And there are risks in sort of managing that too much. So you have to sort of keep it something that can be very dynamic to a lot of different kinds of inputs, and maybe it is a negotiation. But right now we're just in a situation where we just concede the profit maximization under monopoly conditions, and a lot of people have died from that. So we got to do better.
Okay, so we have a hard stop at 1:15, which is coming up in a few seconds. So, Peter, I want to thank you on behalf of Adrian and myself for a really good, solid, interactive seminar today, in which I think we all learned a lot and have a great deal of respect for what you and your organization do. So, with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator for a last word.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Myers. And thank you, Mr. Maybarduk, for your incredibly informative discussion. And we really appreciate the work that you do. And yeah, with that, have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you guys for the opportunity and for all of your work in the public interest.